Good evening. Thanks for coming out to Bears Ears Partnerships Education Center tonight to spend the evening with Ari Barillo. We appreciate you. Let me tell you a bit about our esteemed author. Ari Barillo is a researcher, author, conservationist, and cultural preservationist. He holds a Master of Science in Archaeology from the University of Utah and is a research associate with Archaeology Southwest. His writing has appeared in Kiva, American Antiquity, Archaeology Southwest Magazine, Colorado Plateau Advocate, and the Salt Lake Tribune, along with many regional publications. He is also the author of Behind the Bears Ears, Exploring the Cultural and Natural Histories of a Sacred Landscape, which was chosen by the Forward Book Reviews as their Critics' Choice in Nonfiction for the year 2020. And The Backwoods of Everywhere, Words from a Wandering Local, an essay collection published in 2022. He currently lives in Tucson, Arizona, and is here with us tonight. Come on over.
All right, thanks everyone. And try not to hold any of that against me. I am going to set up a clicker for the slideshow real fast. And while I'm doing that, I want to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about tonight, because American archaeology, quote unquote, is a huge topic that would take about 1 million pages to cover, and I couldn't do that even if I wanted to. What I'm going to talk about instead, I don't know if they covered this in the bylines or anything, but the way that the book and this sort of tour has been advertised is, and here I'm going to quote, goes into archaeology has long captivated the American public, yet pop culture mythology often obscures the harsh realities, thrilling discoveries, and complex moral decisions that archaeologists confront in the field, and goes on from there. What I want to focus on tonight, though, is that pop culture mythology aspect of it. Really, what I'm mainly interested in doing with these public talks is exploring the gap that has appeared between what it is archaeologists really do, what the public thinks we do, and the consequences of that. Some of the consequences of that, anyway. By the way, I know it's technically part of a book readings tour. I don't really like doing book readings, quote unquote. It's a book, you can read it, I encourage that. But, when people come out to a talk, I think people expect something else, something more than that. So I will be reading a little bit from the book, just perfunctorily, but I'm not going to overwhelm you with that. So, pop culture mythology about archaeology. Our story begins here. This is a fellow, anybody recognize him? A fellow named H. Rider Haggard, who in 1885 published this book called King Solomon's Mines, a book about a British fellow who discovers a lost civilization. Hold on to that concept, it'll be important later. Hiding in the deep dark jungle in Africa, there's diamonds involved, you can probably fill in the rest. And that in turn spawned this. This is the Lost Worlds genre of literature. Starting with Arthur Conan Doyle right here in the center of The Lost World, all the way on up to, in recent times, The Lost World by Michael Crichton. And became a very, very popular genre of fiction for a long time, and that in turn inspired this genre of fiction, which fellow creative journalist and actually the founder of Outdoor Magazine, Tim Cahill, characterizes as the men's testicular genre of outdoor adventure magazines. These are some of the tamest ones I could find, and they're all real. They were very, very popular in barber shops and things like that in the early to the mid 1900s. And that in turn inspired this. So what you're looking at here, not many people know this. This is a film that came out in 1954 called The Secret of the Incas, about a dashing American adventurer who goes searching for ancient treasure in exotic locales. His name was Harry Steele. He's seen here sporting a rakish fedora, a leather jacket, and a woman who follows him around. Gender has implications for all this too. Within about 3 decades, that in turn had inspired this. Raiders of the Lost Ark is about an American adventurer who goes searching for ancient treasure in an exotic locale. And here you see him, let me run through it again, rakish fedora, leather jacket, and a woman who follows him around. And the reason they were able to get away with this, by the way, is because both of these films were owned by Paramount Studios, so when the second one did a lot better than the first one in the theaters, they just sort of quietly pretended the first one didn't exist.
Yeah.
But we live in the age of the internet, and you can see it now. What this inspired is a little more complicated. Often comes packaged like this, and there really is, here on the left, there really are 2 definitions for the so-called Indiana Jones effect among mostly social psychologists. First one has to do with denial of an obviously proven finding. You'll notice that, like in the Indiana Jones films, he doesn't believe in the supernatural, and then something supernatural happens. And then the next film, he doesn't believe in the supernatural, and then something supernatural happens, and then it repeats. But the second one, a romanticized, fictional version of something that inspires a lot of real-life people to become genuinely interested in whatever that thing is. That is, it's one side of a coin. I'm going to be talking about both sides of that coin, but that is the positive side of the coin, the influence that Indiana Jones had in popular culture, and I can show it to you here. This is a study, some data compiled by a fellow named Doug Rox McQueen, and it shows the total number of NSF, that's National Science Foundation grants for archaeology, between the years 1950 and 2013. And here's where Raiders came out. So that's the positive spin on this. It inspired a lot of genuine, scientific, well-meaning archaeologists, professional archaeologists, a whole generation of them. And like it or not, we kind of have Indiana Jones to thank for that. Here's the other thing it inspired. Indiana Jones and all the literature that came before it led a ton of people into thinking that archaeology is all about adventure and mystery, and when reality turned out to be a lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of walking, a bit more writing, more writing, a little more walking, a bit more reading. In other words, it didn't come up to their expectations. And when you have expectations of something big and bombastic and exciting, and the reality turns out to be pretty mundane, other things tend to come in and fill that gap, and they're not often good. And I want you to, this is the second time I'm saying this, I'm sorry, but I wanted you to pay special attention to this. Lost civilizations, lost worlds, lost this, lost that. And so that effectively brings us up to the present. Archaeology is unique among probably all, certainly field sciences, probably all scientific practices or science-adjacent practices, and that it has a bunch of different conceptions in mainstream culture, a bunch of different ideas about what we actually do. And, why is that relevant? And that's the point I'm going to be driving toward. Cool story, why is that relevant? Why is that important to us, especially now? And I want you to keep that in your mind as I run through, as briefly as I can, what it is that archaeologists actually do. So what really is archaeology? And here I'm going to read the first of the bits I'm actually going to read from the book. The actual process of archaeology is the construction of history by investigation of the past through analysis of physical stuff that's been left behind. We do this by looking at that stuff and reconstructing the scene or behavior that made it come about. So, for example, you come home to find a house plant smashed on the floor. You collect data on related variables, like the paw prints in the dusty windowsill and the conspicuous absence of your cat. And you determine that the cat did it while you were at work and is now hiding from you. That doesn't tell you why the cat did it necessarily, but you've probably got a few theories in that direction as well. Archaeologists are basically the same. We're detectives in that sense. at least during the data gathering and analysis portions of what we do. We assemble clues, carefully analyze them, apply critical thinking to the results of our analyses, and then confidently hypothesize that Colonel Mustard did it in a rock shelter with a sharpened stick approximately 4,000 years ago. Now again, this doesn't tell you why he did it, and charging into that kind of speculation carries its own special troubles, but that's essentially how archaeologists use inference in science to reconstruct historical events or behaviors when we can't just read written testimony or listen to well-established oral histories about it. So, time detectives. And a little earlier I showed Arthur Conan Doyle's The Cover of his The Lost World. Here he is again jumping into the fray. This is a scene from The Hound of the Baskervilles where Sherlock Holmes, famous detective, is explaining to his compatriot Watson about an archaeological site that ends with, "It's quite a town. When was it inhabited?" And Holmes replies, "Neolithic man, no date," because he's not an archaeologist. But that's essentially what we do in the analytical form of archaeology. And it ran through a series of phases or periods, approximately going like this. The pioneer or speculative period from about the time Christopher Columbus landed in Hispaniola to 1850, so just after the Mexican-American War. Antiquarians, hobbyists, in other words, looking at material history and making wild-ass guesses. Followed by we still kind of do that, but followed by the descriptive period. This is careful note-taking and recording of the quote-unquote vanishing Indians. It was based on the still kind of simmering, but not as robust assumption that native peoples who hadn't been, so to speak, exterminated in the Indian Wars, their culture nonetheless was eventually going to go away because it was considered quote-unquote primitive, and they would eventually become part of normal life as it was described at that time, so we better make sure we catalog and curate everything about them. So, well-meaning racism, in other words. Yeah. Followed by the comparative historic period. This is the construction of chronologies and historic processes. This is processual archaeology. So like the famous Pecos archaeological sequence, Pueblo 1, Pueblo 2, Vascomaker and stuff, that was very, very useful for about 30, maybe 40 seconds. That came about during this time. And then finally and lastly, the interpretive period. Now, this is where we use Western science to explain why primarily non-Western peoples did the things they did, when and where they did them. Remember my analogies earlier. The question why history unfolded the way it did is where it starts getting a little tricky. So this part really involved using science to put thoughts into the minds of the people who, left this material history behind, and that's where it starts to get problematic. Because when I was in grad school, at least among academic archaeologists, this was touted as the high pinnacle, the peak of the evolution of our practice to which it was all ending. And we were out there looking at things, and then we were describing things, and now we're interpreting them, and so we've arrived at last. Which is why I always like showing this quote by one of my favorite authors, Vine Deloria Jr. "Archaeology has been a suspicious science for Indians from the very beginning. People who spend their lives writing tomes on the garbage of other people are not regarded as quite mentally sound in many Indian communities." And what he meant by that, he was a contemporary of some of the folks I was alluding to earlier that were inspired in that generation of archaeologists, scientific archaeologists, including Steve Lexon, who is a bit of an idol of mine, helped me to edit all of my books, and when they were together, when they were colleagues before Deloria passed away, he asked him, what is this great sin that archaeologists are committing? And his response was that it wasn't the sin of investigation, wasn't the sin of curiosity, because that's natural. Humans are curious. If you see something on the ground, you see something in a cliff, especially a painting on a cliff, you're going to get curious about it, you're going to investigate it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's natural to all of us. What he disliked, what he and his contemporaries disliked, was what he called the sin of interpretation. Don't tell us why our ancestors did what we did. just help us to protect it. We'll tell you if we want you to know. If we don't want you to know, maybe don't ask. And that in turn kicked off the, I'm going to circle back to this when I get into who archaeology is, but kicked off a split between academic and field archaeology, culminating in the practice of cultural and heritage resource management, which is about preservation, protection. It's not really about interpretation anymore. It's not about going and digging big holes. It's about trying to protect what's there. And how did that come about? Well, in the beginning, it started off back in the 1800s, the early 1900s, it was definitely a boys' club, pretty much like a white boys' club, kind of like how conservation started with Teddy Roosevelt and the, what do they call themselves, the Boone and Crockett Club, like you had to be rich to be a part of it. So we had folks like William Henry Holmes seen there on the left, Edgar Lee Hewitt seen on the right, and their respective cadres at the Smithsonian Institution, sending people out to investigate things, dig them out of the ground, and then ship most of them back to the Smithsonian. But it didn't take long for that to change. Heading into the early 19 and through to the mid 1900s, you start getting a lot more diversity in terms both of personnel and of practice. So on the left here, you've got A.B. Kidder, the first of many archaeologists to go by their first two initials. That's why I do it. It's not just because I hate my name. But there he is showing a young girl how to do an excavation at, I believe this is Pecos Pueblo. On the right, Earl and Ann Morris. Ann is not as well remembered for what I'm guessing are probably obvious reasons, but also because her life sort of ended tragically and the family sort of wanted to move on from it. But those who know the history of these two know that they made approximately equal contributions. You know, when he was doing all of his work in Aztec, she was in Canyon del Muerto, like she was very much a part of that archaeological effort, almost, if not as much as he was. And that only continued going forward. So this is the point I was going to circle back to. This guy on the left, this is my late friend, mentor, colleague, Dr. Bill Leip, passed away a year ago this month. And we see him on the left there in the legendary Glen Canyon Archaeological Salvage Program. That word salvage really came about in the 1950s in archaeology. And on the right, we see him with a crew of his in, I believe, 1980 on the Dolores Archaeological Project. Really doesn't look like a boys' club anymore, does it? And a lot of this, and a lot of the subsequent evolution of non-academic archaeology had to do with this man. And a paper he published in 1974 with a colleague of his called A Conservation Model for Archaeology, in which he argued archaeological sites are the ultimate non-renewable resource. They don't make them twice. If you dig it, if you burn it or slice into it, if you do some kind of destructive analysis, if you let bulldozers or cows destroy it, whatever happens, it's not coming back. You can't plant a seed and have an archaeological site come back. So we need to be mindful of conservation. It really all started with that man there. And so that brings us up to the present in terms of who is archaeology. Top left, pair of Native American archaeologists. This is 2015, conducting an excavation in Petrified Forest, National Park, Monument Park. Anyway, Petrified Forest. Top right, this is another good friend of mine, as well as a colleague, Margaret Hangen, who was the Heritage Program Director, so head archaeologist at the Kaibab National Forest. That's the forest that surrounds the Grand Canyon, so kind of a big deal. For several decades, right up until last September when she retired. If you know anything about how archaeologists retire, it means she's doing more work now. But as you can see, not white or male. And in the bottom, that's actually from just last year. That's the 2024 class of undergraduate class in archaeology at Cornell University. And that picture, I think, really captures it. Having been a professional archaeologist now for, 16 years? I think 16 years. Every boss I've ever had was a woman, and both of my academic advisors were women. And I've never seen a study on this. I've never seen a paper published, so I don't know the reason for this. I can only tell you what people have told me when I've asked, but we are very, very much a woman-dominated field now. Undoubtedly, especially in the field. I don't know why. I asked my friend Jordan Matson, who's the Four Corners fire archaeologist for the BLM over in Mancos, and she said because she wanted to do this to Indiana Jones. but that's Jordan, she's like that. So I don't know why, but it is very much a woman-dominated field. Wildly different from how it was 100 years earlier. So we made a lot of strides, a lot of what I would call positive strides. Unfortunately, there's still problems that we need to iron out. Person on the left here is Elizabeth Weiss, former professor at UC San Jose, who was fired from her position for doing things like that. It's the cranium of an infant that she posted on, I think, Instagram. And so then subsequently went on this anti-woke campaign with books and talks. And she was actually allowed to present at the 2018 and 2019 Society for American Archaeology conference, where she argued that NAGPRA is basically repackaged creationism. And the fact that she was allowed to do that caused a lot of people like me, more modern archaeologists, to revolt against SAA. Story on the right appears in both the Bears Ears book and the new one, so I'm not going to recap it too much here, but suffice to say that these academics got this idea. They wanted to know about the deep history of Chaco and who was in charge of it. So they did a bunch of MT mitochondrial DNA analyses on the skeletal material that was taken out of there by the Wetherells. It's at the Museum of Natural History. It's technically legally unaffiliated, so they didn't legally have to consult with the tribes before doing it, so they just didn't. Published this and all these, outlets and people all over social media, girls rule, because it turns out that it was either a matriarchal or at least matrilineal society, that, dynastic society that seemed to be in charge of Chaco. And the response, largely from the indigenous, especially Pueblo community, was, well, we could have told you that. Teresa Pascual, in particular, interviewed by ProPublica, came right out and said, if they had asked us, we could have told them. They wouldn't have wasted millions of dollars and gotten in hot water. But they did. So this stuff still goes on, unfortunately, but it's a narrowing part of the field. Mostly what we do now is preservation. We protect history. Why? Why indeed? Having briefly covered the history of archaeology itself, I return to that question that I posed up front. Why? Why is this important? Why is it relevant to tell this story, especially now? And in order to do that, I have to go back in time a little farther. This time, a little bit farther. We're going back to 1300 BC in Egypt. The founders of the 19th dynasty in Egypt set about tearing down, destroying, erasing every vestige, every element they could find, testifying to the very existence of Pharaoh Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, who were the rulers of the 8th dynasty from about 1350 to 1335 BC. Along with their child, Tutankhamun. The only reason we know about these folks is because of archaeologists. Fast forward about 1,000 years. In about 200 BC, the first emperor of the Qing dynasty in China, a fellow by the name of Qin Shi Huang, if I'm pronouncing that right, ordered the burning of all history books and all historians in order to shore up his claim to ancestral domination of the region. In other words, in order to get rid of any testaments, historical literature that might undermine his claim to power and dominance in that region. Fast forward again, this is the 1500s. Not here, but south of here. Franciscan friar by the name of Diego de Landa Calderon ordered the burning of 27 books or codices recording the full history of the Mayan peoples in the Yucatan Peninsula because they were full of, quote, superstitions of the devil and history that he didn't want the people to remember. He wanted them to start from there, year zero. About half a millennium later, now we're in the spring of 1933, students in 34 university towns across Germany burned an estimated 25 to 30,000 books by order and encouragement of Nazi minister of propaganda Joseph Goebbels, who kept a growing list of books he considered alien or decadent, including things like accurate accounts of history. 1 year later, Joseph Stalin put together, as part of his Great Purge, put together a big group of people to do what we would now call Photoshop, removing from the historical records any individuals, elements, news, etc. that, again, might undermine his claim to power. 1975, the long-simmering Khmer Rouge movement, taken over by Pol Pot and his rise to power following the Cambodian Civil War. And under his direction, they radically shifted gears to one of widespread destruction of anything that he deemed corrupting. And that included, again, history books, historians, scholars, intellectuals of all types. Watch a movie called The Killing Fields if you want to see about that. 2014, what you're looking at down there at the bottom in the photograph is what the ancient city of Palmyra looked like pre-2014. On the top is what it looks like now. This would be ISIS, or the Islamic State, destroying ancient and medieval artifacts, museums, libraries, religious buildings, and the like, any pieces of material history that might challenge, again, their ideology, their call to order, things that were worth money, they took out and sold to people like the owners of Hobby Lobby. The rest of it they tried to destroy. And in this regard, they were following a path that was set by the Taliban. Here we see the famous statues of Buddha at Bamiyan, which they destroyed in 2001, and they're still doing this in Afghanistan. Regionally speaking, both of them were creating a handy precedent for the state of Israel to do the same thing in retaliation for Islamic, or to Islamic history, starting with their invasion of the Gaza Strip in 2023 and continuing to this day. This is was a historic mosque. And just over a year later, here in the United States, we elected a government that immediately set about plans to roll back or altogether dissolve funding for anything even tangentially related to the preservation of actual history. This included a proposal to cut the National Historic Preservation Fund down to $0, as well as directing the Department of the Interior to review all educational materials, exhibits, books, posters, signs, and brochures to avoid what it called ideological bias, which includes things like removing displays like this one testifying the fact that slavery was, bad. And that continues. That, in fact, has only ramped up. This is an article from March about the removal of historical posters, brochures, displays in places like Big Bend and Glacier, also Grand Canyon now, and a few others. This is from March, so last month. And this is from last week. That is the proposed budget for the Department of the Interior, specifically the Bureau of Land Management, for the fiscal year 2027. If you can't tell what you're looking at right there, it's this. 100% cut to cultural resources management, along with a 100% cut to wilderness management. Now, again, to be clear, that's the proposed fiscal year 2027 budget. We all know how these things go. It may or may not look like that when it's implemented. But even if it isn't, it shows us what they want. This is what they want, whether it ends up looking like that or not. And I think by this part in the story, we know why it's what they want. Because authoritarians, people obsessed with power, hate real history. Any real history that challenges or seeks to undermine their claim to power. The same as it has going all the way back to 1300 BC, and that's just the earliest example I could find. There's probably dozens of others. It's one of their top priorities. We see this in history again and again and again and again. And for exactly that reason, they also love clowns like this. Because supplementary evils, like what I call supplementary evils like this, like pseudo-archaeology, allows them to engage in what I call pleonectic myth-making. That's my fancy term for the creation of handy fictional bullshit to slot in where the real history has been yanked out. And it's a way of shoring up power. It's a way of shoring up that worldview they want people to believe in. Again, we see this over and over and over and over. Now, pseudo-archaeology itself has its own long and very deep and convoluted history that I'm not going to get into right now. Again, there's a book. But instead, I'm going to focus on two major examples with, I think, arguably the biggest impacts on the human world, where pseudo-archaeology has been the main culprit. One of them is the mysterious case of the mound builders. You see there on the left. The other one is the mysterious case of the Polarians. So the mound builders. What you're seeing there is a newspaper from, when is that from? 1893. Relics of a race about which little is known. Anyway, the controversy, I'll unpack that over time, but the controversy dates back at least to the mid to late 1700s when European colonists encountered the great mounds of the Mississippi region. So this is like Serpent Mound, Cahokia, those places. They hadn't made it out west yet. They would make the same claim when they saw things like Chaco and Cliff Palace, but at the time it was the mounds. And the response was, looking at those that, well, we don't know who made these. It certainly couldn't have been these Native Americans that are around because they're too primitive. They couldn't have done it. So who did it? So they start making up these wild fantasies about lost tribes of white people that came here, built the mounds, and then disappeared into the ground without a trace, handily right before historians showed up. Thomas Jefferson, and this, to his credit, to his immense credit, Thomas Jefferson, as early as 1784, he excavated one of these. He's sometimes called America's first archaeologist for that reason. And in his excavation, while he was excavating, he observed members of local tribes coming to these places, making pilgrimages there, performing rituals, and then either going on or going home. And he wrote in his notes to Virginia at the time, it seems like it's their burial mounds. But nobody believed it. The prevailing attitude is that it must have been some long-lost, mysterious race of humans whom the Native Americans had wiped out without a trace just before Europeans arrived. And this became extremely handy for this fellow, Andrew Jackson, arguably our most racist president, as justification for his extremely brutal and frankly genocidal 1830 Indian Removal Act. I'm going to read a little bit again from the book here. Although, this is speaking about the Indian Removal Act, although many American citizens at the time supported this legislation and its attendant action, significant opposition popped up almost immediately. The act only passed by a hair's breadth, and the opposition to the policy by civilians, religious organizations, and a handful of senators lingered on. This was all to Jackson's considerable chagrin. In his second annual message, we now call the State of the Union address, he excoriated bleeding heart ne'er-do-wells by asking, and here I quote, "What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion?" And I note here, ponding the non sequitur of committing genocide in order to create a space full of liberty is a fundamental exercise. Within that same paragraph, Jackson bemoans those who, quote, wept over the fate of the Aborigines, and praised the forced and bloody removal of indigenous peoples from the eastern states as a, quote, happy consummation of Indian policy. After all, Native Americans themselves were relative newcomers to these lands, and were furthermore guilty of perpetrating far worse crimes on an earlier race of white people, the ones who built all the temples and mounds and whatnot.
Oh, wow.
And here, I'm going to quote him again directly. "In the monuments and fortifications of an unknown people spread over the extensive regions of the West, we behold the memorials of a once powerful race which was exterminated or has disappeared to make room for the existing savage tribes." His argument was basically this: why should we be nice to these brown people when they were so ruthless and bloodthirsty toward the entirely fictional white people that we invented out of whole cloth to justify our own ruthless and bloodthirsty treatment of them? In other words, So walk through the logic on that with me. In his estimation, these folks have been living in this area, doing their own thing, believing their own stuff, and leaving material history all over the place for a long time. And then they came along and said, well, we believe in this thing. We believe in something for which there's no evidence, none whatsoever. But because we choose to believe it, you have to suffer. It's a good thing we never did that again. Anyway. So that was here. That was in the United States. On the other side of the pond, at about the same time, you had the emergence of the so-called spiritualist movement. Now, it takes a little bit to unpack this, but essentially, anytime there's a massive upheaval of worldview, people get nervous, they get panicky, and they start reaching in wild directions. It happened here at the end of the Mexican-American War. You know, America, the United States, now extended from sea to shining sea. And as soon as it did that, everyone went, well, okay, but who are we? Who are we really? We're not Europeans. We just had a whole war about that. We're not Native Americans either. So who are we really? It's this widespread sort of desperate identity crisis that happens when worldviews get shook up. And out of that comes a lot of really creative thinking. The Quakers, the Shakers, the Mennonites, Christian Scientists, Mormonism, all of that came about right about that same time and for the same reason. People going, well, what we thought was true wasn't, and so what's true? Same thing happened in Europe. Starting with folks like Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo demolishing the idea that we're the center of the universe. We had folks like Charles Lyell, the scientific revolution, showing uniformitarianism and the fact that the Earth is a little bit older than 6,000 years. And then in the 1850s, of course, Charles Darwin with The Origin of Species, Descent of Man, knocking us off that pedestal too. So what's the truth? What's going on here? You saw that same sort of panic, and a lot of really creative ideas came out of that. One of them being spiritualism, which is the idea that we are all possessed of an immortal spirit to which certain people can talk if the mood is right and you give them enough money. And one of them was a woman named Helena Blavatsky, seen here on the top right in that slide. And her impact, her creative answer to this would go on to have implications. I'm going to read a little bit more. In her fictional cosmology, the superior race of humans evolved along a specific trajectory that ultimately ended in disaster for them. There were the Polarians, the Hyperboreans, the Lemurians, the Atlanteans, and the Aryans. The original Polarian race reproduced like amoebas, because apparently Blavatsky thought sex was a recent and abominable adaptation. Again, very creative figures these. And the succeeding Hyperborean race occupied all the places now covered in ice. When the ice sheets came, they fled, stopping over at Lemuria, which was her word for the South Pacific, before moving to Atlantis, roughly 100,000 years ago. Then Atlantis sinks into the ocean, and what are now the Aryans flee to other locales, where they lose their magical powers through the practice of frivolous miscegenation. It's all a bunch of hilarious nonsense. But the philosophy at the heart of this hilarious nonsense had a definite appeal for certain types of thinkers soon after she published them in her seminal book, The Secret Doctrine, which you can still read today. The idea was that all the really great things in the world were the work of the Aryans, or the fully realized Homo sapiens race at the absolute top of its game tens of thousands of years ago, but that the Aryan race had become diluted through time by mixing their superior blood with the inferior blood of lower races living in the regions they came to occupy. It's not hard to draw a line between that part of European history and historic American archaeologists frantically looking about for who really built the mighty temples of places like Chichen Itza and the mounds, since the racially inferior Mayans and Native Americans certainly couldn't have done it. This is also the mystical, theosophist, pseudoscientific foundation of Nazism. Seriously, that is the myth underlying the motivation to kill millions of people in order to backbreed humanity into its purest form. And thus we get this. This is Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, and this is, as long as the Aryan lives, as long as our blood, the Nordic Germanic blood is alive, there will be order on this globe of the Lord God. Based on a wildly fictional bunch of cosmological nonsense by a, what we would now call, if not a grifter, then a psychic, publishing her fiction to a hungry audience who wanted to know what their place in the world really was. It's worth noting, by the way, since this is supposed to be about archaeology, this guy, Himmler, also dispatched teams of archaeologists all over the world, or at least to the parts of the world they could reach, especially the Tibetan plateau, so Tibet, Nepal, the upper Himalayas, looking for evidence to support this idea of a superior race, the Aryan race, that had gotten diluted, if only we could backbreed genetically and create them again. They never found any evidence, of course, but it didn't stop them from believing it. The same as it doesn't stop these people when they don't find any evidence. So returning to this stuff one last time, when people say, what's the harm? What's the harm? It's just entertainment. Ancient apocalypse, chariots of the gods, all that stuff. You academics, you bleeding hearts, you always want things to be right. Can't we just have a little fun? What's the harm? That's the harm. The Holocaust, the Indian Removal Act, other evils that I could list, and I do in the book, all supported to some, if not a great extent, by pseudo-archaeology. This is what happens. I said this once already, but this is what happens when you get a whole bunch of people interested in ancient mysteries and treasures and stuff through things like Indiana Jones and King Solomon's Mine, this obsession with lost civilizations and lost people and lost races, and then fail to tell them what archaeology actually is or how it actually works. You end up with a knowledge gap in mainstream culture, and what steps in to fill that gap is usually not good. So what can we do about that? Well, speaking on behalf of archaeologists, this, right here, what we're doing right now, this is what we can do about it. All the way back in the 1700s, scientists were far, far better than they are now. Academics in general were far better than they are now at public scholarship. They used to give talks. I know Louis Agassiz, of course, is famously racist. But to his credit, he would give talks, I think, every week in the square at Harvard so the public could come. They usually hold these talks after work time so that working class people could show up. It was especially useful for women at the time because they were barred from attending universities. So they would show up to these public talks in droves. And which is ironic because now again my science is woman dominated. But they had to, you had to make it interesting to people, you had to make it accessible, a minimum of jargon, you had to make it, entertaining or interesting, something to get the information across to non-academics. One of the ways they would do this is something that is passed down through times as the electrified boy. What they would do is they would hang a young boy from the ceiling with silk thread so that he's not touching anything, and then he would run a massive current through it. And because he wasn't touching anything, he'd be safe, ostensibly, but it would magnetize him. And so people would come up and put pieces of metal on him and things, just to try to keep the public's interest. And if that didn't keep them interested, they'd have like a young girl come up from the audience and kiss him on the cheek, and sparks would fly because of that current. And that was all for the good of society. And it's a shame we just don't electrocute children like that anymore. But anyway, more to the point, we sort of lost that. And so again, to all my fellow researchers, engage with the public, go outside the office, step outside the hallowed halls of academia, and actually talk to people before we lose them all. But as far as everyone else, this kind of stuff, spread the knowledge, to quote this fellow here in the center, my old friend and colleague, Lyle Valenqua. If and I'm not a voice in the wilderness on this, if you go on YouTube, you'll find the likes of Milo Rossi and Flint Dibble, who are very entertaining public scholars in this space. I mentioned already Steve Flexen. Ken Fader's another one who writes really fun books about debunking archaeological myths. Other examples, like, so what you see here on the right, this is Lyle teaching me, along with a young friend of his, young colleague of his, how to do wilderness guiding. That's another thing that has changed radically from how it all began, which, you know, it used to be a very, very privileged space, folks that could afford to go out there and don a Patagonia jacket and they'd be told stories about the land by folks who could afford to go out there and don a Patagonia jacket. And, you know, here we have an indigenous wilderness guide. We've got a bunch of them around here. Lewis Williams most famously owns his own company. Lyle actually works for him now. And, you know, so this trip, for example, you got me spouting my Western scientific, you know, this and that, and then Lyle talking about the oral history, the traditional cultural knowledge that he has. So you get a really holistic look, and that's an option that, you know, is relatively new. Same thing on the left. This is another group that I work with as often as I can. We just put out a magazine about dogs, which is right over there. If you like dogs, pick that up. Josh Ewing is in it. You know, if you write for Archaeology Southwest magazine, or if you pick up any of their magazines, you will find there is no jargon, or very little jargon. There are no in-text citations. There's no extensive references cited. They will come down on you if you, as an academic, try to write academically for them. They are about reaching the public, getting the word out, to try to narrow, if not destroy, that gap of understanding between what it is we do, why it's important, and what the public thinks about what we do. And so on that note, I'm going to leave you with this. If you do a search on Google, well, don't, because Google's evil, but if you do a search anywhere, Bing, DuckDuckGo, that first line, history is a living thing, you'll find hundreds, maybe thousands of hits. A lot of them, Native American scholars like Vine Deloria Jr. said that. The reason that I chose this slide, though, is this is a fellow named C.L.R. James, who was a Senegalese politician, or historian. He was talking in 1956 about ways that emerging African democracies can learn from ancient Greece. And it really speaks to the fact that, like, the lessons of history are everywhere, and they can apply to anyone, and they can be used by anyone. And there's really no limit to that. The only limit is protecting or destroying it. And so that's why, you know, I'm in agreement with, you know, Mr. James and with other colleagues of mine that history is a living thing and it needs to be treated like one. Because like all living things, it can be loved and cared for, nurtured, learned from. It can be ignored. It can be assaulted or hurt. It can be killed. And it's on us to try to keep that from happening. And that's it. By the way, this photo is from Cedar Mesa. I was recording a site up there on contract for the Bureau of Land Management in 2016 on Halloween Day. And the tarantulas decided to migrate right through that site. And we got a lot of these photos. We also had some field workers scream and run away. We ended up nicknaming it, if you look on the site form, it's actually called Halloween Town.